At the end of 1942, Field Marshal von Manstein found himself confronting the most daunting task of his career. The whole southern sector of the Eastern Front teetered on the brink of disintegration throughout January and February 1943, and it seemed only a matter of time before an even greater disaster than Stalingrad overtook the Axis. However, von Manstein's brilliant handling of the crisis would turn a fighting withdrawal into a counterstroke, restoring the situation and enabling German forces to withdraw from the Caucasus and re-establish a stable front. The Red Army's confidence, boosted by the success of Operation Uran, led to a marked improvement in the quality of leadership now that the initiative had been wrested from the Germans.
Soviet propaganda started appealing to soldiers and officers alike, urging them to defend their country, as the Russian armies of yore had defended it under great generals such as Kutuzov, Suvorov, Nakhimov, Ushakov, and others. The government instituted medals, the Order of Alexander Nevsky, the Order of Suvorov, Kutuzov, and so on. In 1943, they even brought back epaulets, epaulets like those the Imperial Army officers used to wear. This increased the prestige of the officers and, to a certain extent, raised their morale. Soviet propaganda, having brought back the regalia of the old Russian army, promised the nation that after the war, life would be better. And that too helped to raise the morale of the troops and the civilians.
At the end of December 1942, the Stalingrad front with 5 armies was encircling the German 6th Army in Stalingrad. The Voronezh front had punched a 150-kilometer wide gap in the sector of the line held by the 8th Italian Army, thus exposing Army Group Don's left flank. The consequences of this were serious. First, 4th Panzer Army's attempt to relieve Stalingrad was called off, thus sealing the fate of the 6th Army. Second, the Soviets were able to close up on the Donets River, the so-called Donets Balcony. The southern front was advancing across the Kalmyk steppe in the direction of Rostov. Von Manstein's grand plan emerged out of the desperate plight of the 3 army groups in southern Ukraine and in the Caucasus. He was convinced that even after the winter battles, the panzer formations could still stabilize the fluid situation if they could be concentrated instead of being scattered all over the front.
Manstein ging es aber im Grunde etwas ganz anderes.
What was at stake, as really in all the earlier and later conferences, was Manstein's consistent pleas for freedom of operation. Freedom of decision on operational possibilities, he used to say, that's where our only chance lies. Hitler's way of thinking, on the other hand, his military way of thinking was static. Hold on to what we've got, never let anything go, consolidate, construct fortifications, don't yield any ground, not an inch of ground.
Von Manstein's aim was to extract as many of the panzer formations as possible and regain the initiative by using them to smash the Soviet forces which were enveloping his left wing. But Hitler thought differently, and in a telephone conversation with von Manstein on the 26th of December said,
Ja, ich wollte Sie über die Lage sprechen. Sie haben...
I want to talk to you about the situation. I see from your daily situation report that you have made a request for troops to be withdrawn from the Caucasus and moved up north and placed under your command for the relief of Stalingrad. I cannot authorize this request.
Kann ich nicht genehmigen. Darauf Manstein, was soll...
Von Manstein countered, what are those troops supposed to be doing up there in the Caucasus with a front to the south? Hitler, we need the oil in Baku.
Baku. Sagt Manstein.
Von Manstein, but first I must restore the situation. I must get the 6th Army out of Stalingrad, or at least re-establish a continuous front. Up there, the troops are completely useless.
Und da sagt Hitler, Herr Feldmarschall.
Then Hitler said, Herr Feldmarschall. He never said Herr von Manstein. Herr Feldmarschall, if we cannot keep and hold the oil in Baku, we shall lose the war.
Von Manstein realized that the most serious threat was to the 1st Panzer Army 600 kilometers to the south in the Caucasus. And so it was imperative, despite the severe threat to his left flank, that 4th Panzer Army keep open the Donetsk crossings near Rostov.
Erstens musste geregelt werden die Kampfführung.
The first thing to be settled was the combat tactics of the 4th Panzer Army to the south, in conjunction with a Holland army detachment between the Donets and the Mius. The reason for this was to keep the crossing points at Rostov open for the approaching 1st Panzer Army, and later for the 4th Panzer Army. Secondly, the 1st Panzer Army had to be moved out under the protection of the shield and engage against the enemy, who had already penetrated far to the south across the Donets, deep into our flanks and in our rear. And finally, the 4th Panzer Army had to be moved back through Rostov, in conjunction with a Holland army detachment, and push straight to the north, so as to strike at the enemy forces, which were threatening the Dnieper crossings in the direction of Dnipropetrovsk, and therefore our rearward communications.
After bitter fighting in January, 1st Panzer Army was able to withdraw through Rostov and came under von Manstein's command on the 27th of January. He extracted it from the bitter rearguard actions in which it was involved and used it to shore up his crumbling left flank by attacking any enemy forces which crossed the Donets between Voroshilovgrad and Lysychansk. Von Manstein now moved his headquarters from Taganrog to Stalino, so as to be nearer the assembly area for his counterstroke forces. In Stalingrad, the defenders were making their last stand in the city's Red Square.
Dazu kann ich nur sagen,
About that, the order was, hold Stalingrad to the last bullet. The dreadful end illustrated.
einen großen Erfolg.
A big success, if one can call it a success, was that by sacrificing itself, the 6th Army tied up 10 Russian armies in this area and held them in check until von Manstein was able to build up a new defense line.
Die neue Verteidigung aufgebaut hatte.
On the 31st of January 1943, the southern sector of Stalingrad, under the personal command of Field Marshal Paulus, surrendered. With the surrender of the German 6th Army, the main Soviet aim now was the liberation of the Ukraine. To this end, the Voronezh front was to exploit the collapse of Army Group B on the upper Donets and retake the industrial area around Kharkov. The southwestern and southern fronts, with 4 armies, were to liberate the coal and steel-producing area of the Donetsk basin. The Front Mobile Group, named after its commander, Markian Mikhailovich Popov, was to head for Krasnoarmeysk, 3rd Guards Army for Voroshilovgrad, and 1st Guards Army for Krasny Liman. Popov's group consisted of 4 tank corps, 3 rifle divisions, and 2 independent tank brigades. Its establishment was 500 tanks, but it actually fielded only 137. As the situation worsened, von Manstein asked for permission to withdraw his right wing to the Dnieper and to use the forces thus released to recover his operational freedom. Hitler's response was to dispatch his personal aeroplane to bring von Manstein to his headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia. After grappling with the problem for hours, Field Marshal von Manstein convinced Hitler that the only solution was to withdraw the right flank of Army Group Don to the Mius River, so that 4th Panzer Army could be redeployed from the lower Don to the left flank of 1st Panzer Army, and then used to halt the Soviet offensive between the rivers Donets and Dnieper. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, newly arrived from France with 3 fresh and fully equipped Waffen SS Panzer divisions in the Kharkov area, was to move south so that all panzer formations could be used in a coordinated counterstroke against the Soviet forces. Hitler's decision now meant that von Manstein could begin preparations for the counterstroke. By the middle of February, the Voronezh front had torn a huge gap in the German line between Belgorod and Lysychansk, through which 6 Soviet armies were heading for the Dnieper and Dnepropetrovsk. The 6th and 1st Guards armies and the Popov group of the southwestern front were streaming through the gap between Kharkov and the left flank of 1st Panzer Army in the general direction of Pavlograd. The redeployment of the 1st and 4th Panzer armies was interpreted by Stalin as a strategic withdrawal. And so the Soviet Supreme Command ordered the Voronezh front to capture Zaporozhye, thereby cutting off Army Group Don's supply arteries and main line of retreat over the Dnieper via Dnepropetrovsk.
Ja, ich war ein junger Leutnant und kam aus dem Land.
Yes, I was a young lieutenant and came back from hospital having been wounded to join my division, which was in Stalingrad. But I only got as far as Rostov on the Don.
Wir wussten natürlich nicht, was
We naturally didn't know what was happening.
das dort starke
But we saw that there were big movements in progress there, and that the enemy was putting increasing pressure on Rostov, so as to close this narrow bottleneck.
engen Flaschenhals zuzumachen. Wir wurden dann zusammengefasst.
Then we were gathered together and had to stop advancing Soviet forces in the northern suburbs of Rostov. And we noted that the Soviets were pushing even further to the northwest, in the direction of the middle Dnieper.
Vorstießen. Das bemerkte man dadurch, dass auf einmal keine
One noticed that no more trains were coming, and we had to wait to load our vehicles, so that we could return to Germany to be reformed.
werden nach Deutschland, wieder aufgestellt zu werden.
Despite their successes, the troops of the Voronezh front had suffered heavy losses and were beginning to outrun their supply services, which had to struggle for hundreds of kilometers over bad roads. Popov's mechanized group swung south and headed for Krasnoarmeysk. Lance Kempf Force on the left flank of Army Group Don, now renamed Army Group South, was ordered south to delay the Soviet advance in the direction of Poltava and hold Kharkov as long as possible without allowing itself to be encircled. However, commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, General Paul Hauser, was not prepared to sacrifice his corps, and despite Hitler's direct order to hold the city, he allowed the Soviets to retake it on the 14th of February. As the panzer formations moved from north to south to their forming up positions for the counterstroke, this left virtually no mobile reserves in the center of the southern front. In the south, 1st Panzer Army was trying to stop Popov in the area around Slavyansk. Fighting had also flared up in Holit Forces sector on the Mius front. Hitler chose the 17th of February to make one of his rare visits to the front to discuss the critical situation with von Manstein and try to resolve their differences of opinion on the conduct of the campaign. Hitler was preoccupied with the retention of the industrial region of the Donetsk Basin and Kharkov. Manstein argued that such objectives were irrelevant as long as the Red Army remained undefeated in the field. While Hitler demanded the recapture of Kharkov, von Manstein explained that the further west the Soviets penetrated, the more effective would be his counterstroke. All von Manstein demanded was the opportunity to concentrate his panzer forces, even if it meant temporarily giving up ground to the Soviets. When next day Hitler flew back to Rastenburg, von Manstein was relieved to see him go. He had secured Hitler's agreement to his operational plan, and it had been reported that Soviet tanks were only 60 kilometers away and there were no German units to stop them.
Den 20. Februar rum.
About the 20th of February, the situation became critical. The enemy had broken through the Mius front at 2 points. They had advanced across the Donets on the right flank of the 1st Panzer Army, and our army detachment in the north, under Kempf, had lost a great deal of ground.
Although heavily outnumbered, in some places by as much as 8 to 1, von Manstein had the following forces to redeploy in order to regain the initiative. Kempf Force, 4th Panzer Army with 2nd SS Panzer Corps, 48th Panzer Corps, and remnants of 57th Panzer Corps. 1st Panzer Army with 40th Panzer Corps, 3rd Panzer Corps and Hollet Force, totaling 9 panzer divisions, 2 Panzer Grenadier and a number of German infantry divisions and remnants of Italian and Romanian units. Field Marshal von Manstein's primary aim was to destroy the enemy, which had crossed the Donets River by a counterstroke beginning on the 19th of February. Kempf's force was to attack southwards and delay the right flank of the 6th Soviet Guards Army in the area forward of Poltava and cover the deep flank of the attacking 4th Panzer Army. Directly in the path of 1st Guards Army's main thrust at Dnipropetrovsk was 48th Panzer Corps and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps of the 4th Panzer Army, whose task was to attack the enemy flanks in the gap between Kempf's force and 1st Panzer Army and reach the Donets west of Izum. 1st Panzer Army was to attack northeastwards and destroy Popov's group, and then advance to the Donets east of Izum. Hollet force was to hold the Mius position from Taganrog to northeast of Stalino. The snow-covered Ukrainian soil was hard, and only villages offered any shelter or concealment. At night it was often minus 15 degrees centigrade. The terrain was open and undulating, intersected by frozen brooks. Visibility in good weather was from 13 to 20 kilometers.
Der 21. Februar brachte die
The turning point came on the 21st of February. The Mius front was holding. The enemy units which had broken through were encircled, and the attacks against our front line had subsided. The enemy attack across the Donets on the right flank of the 1st Panzer Army was contained.
1st Panzer Army, with 11th Panzer Division under the command of Lieutenant General Hermann Balk, together with 7th Panzer and 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, engaged Popov's group at Kramatorsk. After a week of hard fighting, Popov's group had been severely mauled by 1st Panzer Army. On its right flank, Balk was anxious to disengage his 16 tanks and attack the rear of Popov's main force, which had been halted south of Stepanovka and was running out of supplies. The deep snow made rapid movement difficult, but Balk managed to organize some snow plows. On each, he put an energetic officer and sent them off across the steppe in a southerly direction. 2 hours later, 11th and parts of 7th Panzer Division crossed Popov's line of advance and ploughed through the group's rear services. On a wide front, the panzers passed through Kramatorsk in their advance towards Novotroitskoye, where a fierce battle was raging. This attack from a totally unexpected direction signaled the end of Popov's group, and its remnants were chased back across the river Toryets, where they held out in the town of Barvienkovo. The first attempt to dislodge the Soviets was repulsed.
Und am Nachmittag bekam ich dann den Befehl, dass ich den Ort zu nehmen hatte.
And in the afternoon I received orders to take the village. So I ordered my company to get moving and take it. But since we knew that it was full of tanks and Russians, no one moved.
Das Panzersteck voller Russischer fuhr kein Mensch. Daraufhin habe ich erst
He replied, Strachwitz, how you do it, I have no idea. The only thing I can tell you is that you've got to take it.
und daraufhin habe ich meiner Kompanie
And each of you will get behind a house.
jeder erstmal hinter ein Haus.
Then we shall see what the Russians are going to do, what the resistance is like, and what is coming up. And we did just that.
Und das machten wir auch. Ich fuhr als
I took the lead, since probably if I hadn't, no one would have moved at all. And we did 75 kilometers an hour. I've never driven so fast in a tank before or since as I did over that open country. And this must have been a frightfully impressive sight for the Russians in the village, since every tank had a great cloud of snow behind it, which whirled and whirled round and round. So we drove into the village, and each tank got behind a house. My gun projected into a window, and we couldn't drive any further. And then we discovered that At the same speed with which we had driven in, the Russians had beaten it on the other side, and without firing a shot. No one fired at all, neither we nor the Russians. It was by genuine chance that the Russians lost their nerve. Otherwise they would have made mincemeat of us.
Den 21. Februar rum.
The turning point came about the 21st of February. The enemy units which had broken through on the Mius front were bottled up. The attack across the Donets on the right flank of the 1st Panzer Army had been contained, and the 4th Panzer Army had achieved a notable victory at Pavlograd and beaten and partly destroyed those enemy units which had advanced a long way to the southwest. This eliminated the threat which we had faced at the Dnieper crossings. As from that moment, both the Field Marshal and I were confident that we would achieve the objective we had set ourselves. The situation continued to improve until the 2nd of March, because the Russians had weakened in their confrontation with the 1st Panzer Army. They retreated across the Donets so that we were able to give the order on the 28th of February for the attack on Kharkov.
Whilst 1st Panzer Army was destroying the Popov group in the areas of Grishino and Kramatorsk, the 4th Panzer Army with 4 panzer divisions attacked northwards, taking the Soviets by surprise. The 17th Panzer Division, commanded by General Fridolin, von Zenger and Etterlin, on the right flank of 4th Panzer Army, reached the Donets between Izum and Balakleya. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps on the left flank encountered little resistance until it approached Kharkov and established contact with Kempf force on its left. Field Marshal von Manstein now began the destruction of the Soviet forces in the Kharkov area. By the 10th of March, 2nd SS Panzer Corps was sweeping round the north of Kharkov into the rear of the enemy forces facing 48th Panzer Corps. To make up for its precipitous withdrawal from Kharkov a month earlier, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps could not resist the opportunity to retake the city on the 14th of March. On the following day, Chuguyev fell to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and the Soviets found their main line of retreat blocked. To protect his northern flank, von Manstein ordered his 4th Panzer Army to seize Belgorod, which fell to the 1st SS Panzer Division by a coup de main on the 18th of March.
The counter-stroke can be summed up in a single sentence: the salvation of the entire southern front in the campaign in the east. The old position on the 1941 to 1942 was reconstituted as a result of it. The enemy forces which had broken through were smashed, and they lost hundreds of tanks and guns, and thousands as prisoners. In addition, the muddy period which was setting in brought the whole southern front once again to a firm halt.
In studying once again the sequence of events shown in the maps, it is possible to look through the tangle of arrows and see the brilliant simplicity of Field Marshal von Manstein's concept. The Soviets misread his redeployment of forces as a strategic withdrawal, and in their eagerness to repeat their success at Stalingrad, they overreached themselves. As the Soviet armored spearheads pierced the Axis lines and ranged far and wide over the steppe, they left their supply columns far behind, and then, just as a decisive victory was within their grasp, they ran out of fuel. The German retreat suddenly stopped, turned about, and transformed itself into a powerful, carefully coordinated and devastating counterstroke. Because it fell between Germany's 2 great defeats, Stalingrad and the Battle of Kursk, the counterstroke has been overshadowed until recently by those disasters. But today it is seen as one of Germany's greatest military achievements.
Military history does not repeat itself, and therefore lessons can only be drawn from it with great care. Even so, it is important to understand today what those weaknesses were and how they were exploited by the German side in order to fulfill their mission of strategic defense. First, there was the immature and inflexible command and control system of the Soviets. They needed a long time to prepare their offensive operations. These were set out in phases and with intermediate objectives in great detail. Everything was pre-planned, and so there was no flexibility at lower levels of command. The lack of cooperation between different arms within the Soviet army on the battlefield was another weakness. Each arm had tended to develop independently and without integration. Thus, for example, the Soviets possessed no mechanized or armored infantry, and their soldiers advancing on foot could therefore easily be separated from their attacking tanks. And in contrast to this, the German side had a very well tried command and control system, which through the concept of directives rather than specific orders allowed the greatest possible room for maneuver to a subordinate commander, right down to the individual tank commander. The core of the counterstroke were the fully armored brigade-sized task forces of battle tanks, armored infantry, armored artillery, armored engineers, whose vulnerability was very small, but whose mobility was high. The commander of such a task force combined shock action and firepower for the counterstroke. The counterstroke, as the film illustrated, was the principal element in the mobile defensive battle at the tactical and operational levels. Its key characteristic, in contrast to the counterattack, was that it was directed spontaneously against an enemy in the process of his advancing, and therefore an enemy not well situated or prepared to defend himself. It could hardly be pre-planned, but relied instead on seizing the advantage of a given situation whenever the enemy's weaknesses could best be exploited in order to destroy him.